So when we wrote the first manual, 2013, and we did the doctrine, we put in this quad chart because that's as far as we could get. In the amount of time we had to finish that doctrine, we could not explicate a new ethic for the Army. We just did that in 2015 in the version you read last night, but in 2013 we didn't get there. But notice what this chart tells you. We discovered in 2013 one of the biggest problems in the United States Army is we had too many ethics. We've got ethics everywhere. Everybody's got their own little ethic. There's one for the Army civilians, and one for the NCOs, and one for West Point, and the Soldier's Creed, and the Warrior Ethos, and the NCO. We didn't have room to put them in the quad chart. But we also discovered, when we were studying the ethic this way, that it's composed of legal elements which influence the Army as an institution, and some of which influence you as individuals. The Constitution and Title 10 prescribe what's in your oath for individuals. Status of forces agreements, treaties, law of war, rules of engagement, and soldier rules. So the left side is the legal foundation. Listen carefully. In your ethic, that is the minimum standard. Minimum standard. The law is always the minimum standard. The law in America is nothing more than what the society as a whole can agree on by consensus to live by in community. That's what the law is. It's absolutely essential, absolutely necessary, but it is the minimum. And then there's the moral foundation, which in many cases is the higher standard. Over here, the moral foundation of the Army for the institution, some of it comes from the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution. The Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is a moral foundation of the Army ethic. All are created equal. That's an immensely important moral principle that undergirds the concept of profession. Now, let me point out one other thing here. Different motivations come from each side of the ethic. You're going to study motivations in your leadership course. What kind of motivation comes from the legal foundation? The motivation of obligation. What do we call that? We call that the duty concept. The duty concept, an absolutely essential concept among military professions. I must do my duty. In fact, in UCMJ, we have an article that says, if you do not do your duty, you may be punished because of dereliction of duty. So the motivation over here is the motivation of obligation. And this usually comes and usually is manifested under transactional leadership, the transactional forms of leadership. Now, if you read Leadership Doctrine recently, you will this year, but if you've read it, the Army says that there are two types of leadership, transactional and transformational, and the Army wants transformational used in most situations. Though it recognizes in extremis, in some situations and with some people, transactional leadership is necessary. This is the compliance culture, folks. Do it because I said so. Do it because it's legal. Do it because it's required. Now, that's a different motivation that comes from this side of the ethic. This side of the ethic is a motivation of aspiration. This is transformational leadership, where leaders lead their organization by shared vision. There's a charismatic aspect of it. There's an authenticity aspect of it. The leader is so integral, so authentic, that the follower says, I can believe what this person is saying. I have seen enough of their actions. I can follow this person because I want to follow this. Not because I have to, not because of sanctions, because I have chosen to do what this leader is prescribing. This is what we want. This is what you want in your units. This is what you want to practice, folks. This is what the United States Army needs if it's going to be a profession. We should use the leadership on this side absolutely to the minimum possible. And I'm sure you all know, as well as I know, that in the last 14 years, you got a big dose of leadership on the left side. There's a whole new field of study called lawfare. And there are new journals on lawfare and the influence of law on warfare. So, we are where we are. That's how we lead professions. Ethics have to evolve over time. But beware that the ethic is manifested through leadership. The ethic is not just some abstract concept. It is the foundation from which we lead. So, what did we write in the new manual? Next chart. On page 26 in the new manual you studied, we put in some moral identities. And this moral identity, incidentally, came from you folks. I don't know how many of you participated with the Chief of Staff at a solarium a year and a half ago here at Leavenworth. When the Chief came out to talk as we were developing the ethic and we were working on moral identities, he came out here, he met with a group of captains from around the Army and some of the majors, and we got a notice a couple days later, they've already decided what the identity of the Army professional is. It's going to be trusted Army professionals, because that's what you folks wanted. And I think it was a brilliant idea. As the top moral identity, remember, all military departments use an identity-based leader development system. It comes out of the theory, social identity theory. If we can create the right identity, we can capture an immense amount of personal motivation. The Marines do this wonderfully. They know what a Marine is. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Marine is a moral concept. To some of them, it's an intensely physical concept also. But they understand the obligation of being, the moral obligation of being a Marine. So we've introduced some new, how about servant? How does that fit with you? You see yourself as a servant? In fact, you are. You've been doing it for a number of years. Do you credit yourself for having done it? Is that esteemable? Do you pass it on to other people? Because you can say, I am morally obligated to protect you to the loss of my life. Notice this. We wrote 10 statements of these. This is one of 3, this is one of 4. You add them up, there's 10 statements. We accomplish the mission and understand it may demand courageously risking our lives and justly taking the lives of others. There's a military ethicist who's now retired. He taught for many years at the Air University, James Toner. He wrote a book entitled True Faith and Allegiance. In the book, he makes a compelling case that there's only 4 purposes for the American soldier. 4 tasks that the American soldier must be able to accomplish. The first task that you must be able to accomplish is to prepare to kill. We're in the killing and dying business. We're unlike other professions. The second task is when under right authority, you must kill. The American people give you sanction to take life. We're having a great debate today in America about the police abusing the sanction to take life. Have you ever heard a debate about the military's ability to take life? I mean, they debated our horrible ethics in some really egregious cases, but by and large, the institution has seldom ever been criticized. So the first task, prepare to kill. Second task, to kill. And since you're in the killing business, you have to be in the dying business. So the third task of the American soldier is to prepare to die. Many of you have been through that practice. You know what it feels like. And the fourth task of the American soldier is, when necessary, to die. See, this profession, this is not like bureaucracy. This is an immensely deep moral obligation and commitment that you have. You serve with unlimited liability. Few other people in America serve with unlimited liability. Police do, first responders do. That's about it. So, that's the ethic. There are now 10 principles, not something to be memorized, not in an acrostic so that you can put them on a dog tag or something. No, these are deeply thought about principles that you need to adopt and think about while you're here. Next chart. So now I want to go to the last subject. We've discovered profession, we've discussed the steward's challenge of the ethic, getting the right motivations, and now I want to talk about the last issue, the application of the ethic. How do we use it? This is a busy chart, so I'm only going to talk about the bottom part of it. Next chart. But I need to talk about this, James Rest's model of moral decision-making. I'm not going to discuss these, there's not time, but there are ways to improve this process, but for right now, let me just describe it. And let me admit that this is a horrible diagram. And the reason it's a horrible diagram, I'm taking a human process and putting it in 2 dimensions. And we all know nothing is monocausal with human beings. So I can't put it on 2 dimensions. This is really a repetitive spiraling process that goes back and forth. You go through this, but basically when you're going through these repetitive discretionary judgments that are your professional practice, this is the way that people who study in this field tell us that we can think about that process. First, you have to recognize the moral content in every decision. If you can't see the moral content in the situation you're about to decide upon, how can you possibly make a decision by including that moral consideration? There's some interesting research out there, folks. One of the big things we know is the higher the emotional intelligence, the higher the moral character of the decision maker, the more they will see the moral content in the situation. That's another reason that we need to be very concerned about how we develop the character of our leaders. Leaders of high character see more context with which to process the decision. So after you've done the recognition, then you'll go to a moral judgment. In the Army and in the military, most places they teach 3 methods of moral reasoning. I'm not sure, Ted, what you teach here, but the 3 that are normally taught, one is follow the rules. That's deontological. The rule is a good rule. If you follow the rule, you will get a good outcome. That is adopted from practices in the past. It works well. But it is only one method of doing moral decision making. The second method is consequentialist. Relationship between ends and means. Be careful of consequentialist reasonings. It comes in about 2 or 3 different flavors, the moral philosophers tell us. And there is the possibility when you're doing consequentialist reasoning, if you really want this outcome, you may really jack up the means, and all of a sudden you got the end justifying the means. And that is the fallacy of moral reasoning. But absent that fallacy, consequential reasoning is as good as deontological reasoning, applied in different cases. Actually, we want you to think about all 3. And the third one is what's called virtue ethics. Virtue ethics has long been part of the Army ethic. And virtue ethics is rather straightforward. It simply says a person of high virtue, a person of high character can be counted on most of the time to make good decisions. Therefore, if we work on developing the virtue of our leaders, we are going to be working simultaneously on the health of the professional practice as they make these decisions. Now, we call this, in a lot of our literature, these 2 processes, we call these 2 processes resolving the moral dilemma. Resolving the moral dilemma. And then we get over here to the step of moral intentions. Now we come to the hard part in moral decision making, because up to this point it's been the situation, and this is a pretty cognitive, this is a pretty rational process. We're pretty good at that. We can teach reasoning. And now we get to the state of intentions before you take action. And the state of intentions, the psychologists tell us, is the last place when your personal considerations go into the decision. And then you start asking yourself, well, what's this going to do to my unit? Well, what do we look like if we do this? What will the Army look like? Oh, what will I look like? What will happen to me? And so now personal considerations. So while over here we were working on a moral dilemma, now we're working on character success or character failure. It's no longer a moral dilemma. When we get done with this point, we know what the morally commendable action is. The question is, do we have the strength of character to take that decision and follow through on it? Here's what it looks like. Next chart. There's character. It's the fulcrum. You're making a decision. Folks, there's only 2 things on the teeter-totter: cowardice and courage. Sorry, there's no middle. Cowardice or courage. See why we got a problem with sexual assault and sexual harassment? Bystanders want to be safe. There's no neutral ground. So in fact, they'll display cowardice and do nothing. I understand this is a stark diagram. I understand that this is a stark part of the presentation. But folks, that's where we are. This is what it takes to be a profession. Developing leaders of courage, of high character, so that when they're repetitively making these discretionary judgments, then we're going to get to where we want to go. Next chart. I only want to show you on this chart, the Army is now working on some major work on strength of character. In fact, your leadership department here is going to work on an elective this semester that some of you can apply for. So I'm obviously highlighting something you may be interested in. The research question's not totally formed yet, but it's probably going to be something about the relationship between the character of the leader and the trust developed in leadership. A remarkable subject, if some of you are interested, particularly some of you who have behavioral or leadership backgrounds. This would be a fascinating project to work on because you do have data. You have a CASL. Right here in Leavenworth, you produce a CASL every 2 years, the Center for Army Leadership Report of Leadership in the Army. It's a 9-year longitudinal database. You can't find a longitudinal database on any of that subject anywhere else in the Army. And the Center for Profession and Ethics has just started a new longitudinal database on the state of the Army as a profession. Excuse me. How much we're developing. Notice, by the first survey, fully 1/3 of the Army says their leaders are expending no effort to develop their character. Fact is, if you look through the Army literature, I don't think you'll find a model for character development for the United States Army. We can't even have a conversation on this because we don't agree on how it happens. So we got some work to do in this area if we're going to be a profession for Army 2025. Next chart. So I want to conclude with this. When we started the research on the profession studies over 10 years ago, we went out and did field research with majors, just like you, except they were a lot younger then. We did symbologic research. We said, come with a symbol of profession. And we want to talk about that symbol and why you believe the symbol. We had officers come with Smokey Bear hats. Think about that. They saw more professionalism in the non-commissioned officer corps than did in the officer corps, at least within their branch. Now, the Cav guys brought black hats, spurs. I mean, some people brought green berets. This officer brought nothing. And so when we said, well, why didn't you bring something we can talk about? Professionalism. He says, and this was his response, one sentence. How can I be a professional if there is no profession? Now I've connected the two levels of research, institution and individual. If there is no profession, folks, we will not develop professionals. I can assure you, because we looked, there is no history in America of a professional ever being developed in a bureaucracy. They may work in bureaucracies later after they're developed. Many do, and many of you will. But you were not developed there. You were developed in a professional, in a culture of trust and mentored by other professionals. And that's the challenge we have in the Army of creating that. And that takes a twofold approach. You got to work on the bad barrel, which is institutional, culture, environment, and you got to work on the bad apples. That's getting people of higher individual moral character. Different disciplines, different approaches. Stewards, that's, in my judgment, the third challenge facing you now. So, final chart. There's your three challenges. Will profession dominate bureaucracy? Will the ethic be used to create the right motivations through the right form of leadership, primarily transformational? And can we develop character? Boy, we can train. The Army knows how to train. We can develop competence. Trust, folks, most all the studies show us, trust comes from far more than competence. Fact is, most of the research would indicate it's at least close to equal parts competence and character. Followers will rate competence and character. In fact, as that research came from Army soldiers in Iraq on a project that was done by two psychologists at West Point. It was one of the first bits of research going all the way back to the Second World War to indicate that character was even close to competence. Because up to that point, soldiers had always said, I want the most competent leader possible because he or she is going to get me home alive. And in the Iraq War, the research came back, there was no statistical significance between the two. So that's where we are. Those are your three challenges. I started out with the statement that armies, professions can die. And therefore, if the United States Army is trying to be an army, it can die. Let me reassert that to you. When I was the chief of plans in Heidelberg in 1980, the CG of TRADOC came over every year and visited with 7 land armies, and they were all professions. And what they did in those meetings, they exchanged ideas on expert knowledge and expert practice, because they had doctrinal communities somewhat like ours. 7. How many of those armies today are still military professions? You fought with them in Afghanistan. You fought with them in Iraq. Go back to your seminar rooms and discuss it. How many are still professions? Did they use their expert knowledge or did they use yours? Did they use their expert practice or did they use yours? I would submit there's far fewer than 7 today. Military professions can die. I have seen it happen in my lifetime. They don't go away when they die. They morph into being just obedient military bureaucracies. They still wear uniforms. They still get paid by their government. But they are not developing expert knowledge and they are not developing expert practice, and that is what professions do. So what are your questions?